Turin, January 3, 1889. It's cold and the city is shrouded in a winter haze. Friedrich Nietzsche, who had spent several years moving between Italy, Switzerland, and France because of his fragile health, goes out for a morning walk. That day, he suffers a mental collapse from which he will never recover. Afterward, friends take care of him, then his mother, and later his sister. He will spend the last 11 years of his life in a state of progressive decline, passing away in 1900. What exactly happened on the street is subject to different accounts. The most widely told version says Nietzsche saw a coachman whipping a horse, ran to the animal, embraced it, broke down in tears, and then collapsed to the ground. This scene has been repeated for over a century by biographers and popular writers, although historians caution that we don't have direct evidence confirming every detail. What is certain is that after that day in Turin, Nietzsche was never the same. But the scene itself isn't the point. The idea is. A few years earlier, Nietzsche had written a line that would leave a mark on Western thought. God is dead. It appears in The Gay Science, published in 1882, and is later explored in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The phrase wasn't a mere provocative jab at religion. It wasn't a superficial attack on Christianity. It was a diagnosis of a profound cultural shift. When Nietzsche says God is dead, he isn't claiming that a divine being has literally died. He's describing the collapse of faith in the absolute values that had for centuries structured Europe's moral life. Christianity, the idea of a transcendent order, the belief in an ultimate meaning guaranteed by a higher power, all of it was ceasing to be the unquestioned foundation of modern society. And here lies the heart of the problem. If God is no longer the basis of right and wrong, what holds morality together? If there's no transcendent order to guarantee the meaning of life, who does? If there's no ultimate authority to judge our actions, what holds us accountable? These aren't theological questions, they're existential ones. In the 19th century, Europe is undergoing profound change. The Industrial Revolution reshapes society. Scientific progress challenges traditional religious explanations. Biblical criticism, Darwinism, and rationalism erode certainties that had seemed unshakable for centuries. Technological progress comes hand in hand with a growing sense of moral disorientation. Nietzsche didn't invent this crisis. He observed it and laid it out with brutal clarity. But he wasn't alone. Before him, Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher born in 1813, had already sensed another layer of the problem. While the dominant philosophy of his time, especially Hegel's system, tried to build totalizing rational explanations, Kierkegaard focused on the individual, on the inner experience, on anxiety. Kierkegaard didn't reject faith. In fact, his thought is deeply Christian, but he saw something unsettling. Even in a formally believing society, the individual could live without authenticity. People could hide in the crowd, in social conventions, in a superficial practice of religion. In 1844, he published The Concept of Anxiety. There, he described anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, not just a simple fear, but the feeling that arises when a human faces the possibility of choice. And here, the connection is clear. When values are no longer given unquestioningly, choosing becomes harder. Without an obvious transcendent standard, responsibility falls squarely on the individual. The problem isn't just the absence of God. The problem is freedom. In the 20th century, after the World Wars, that freedom would be pushed to the extreme by Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre claimed that existence precedes essence, meaning humans are not born with a fixed nature or purpose. We exist first, and only then define ourselves through our actions. And from this comes a stark consequence. We are condemned to be free. Condemned because we cannot stop choosing. Even not choosing is a choice. The line connecting Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre is neither uniform nor doctrinal. Their conclusions differ, but they all confront the same cultural wound. How do you live when you can no longer take refuge in unquestionable, absolute certainties? Nietzsche responds by proposing the creation of new values. Kierkegaard emphasizes the leap of faith and individual responsibility before God. Sartre insists that without God, we are entirely accountable for our actions. Three different answers to the same abyss. And that abyss isn't confined to the 19th or 20th century. It's still with us today. When someone says, "Everyone has their own truth," they're grappling with a direct consequence of that cultural death of God. When someone claims morality is relative, that there are no objective foundations, that everything depends on perspective, they are walking on the very ground Nietzsche described. But the question isn't whether that description is accurate. The question is something else. If God doesn't exist, who answers for your actions? To understand why existentialism didn't emerge as an intellectual trend, but as a historical necessity, we have to stop in Copenhagen in the first half of the 19th century and look closely at Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard was born in 1813 into a well-off, deeply religious family. His father, Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard, was a man of intense Lutheran faith and melancholic temperament. That influence would profoundly shape the young Søren's sensibility. From an early age, he became familiar with the Bible, with guilt, and with the idea of responsibility before God. But what mattered most wasn't just his religious upbringing. What really mattered was his opposition to the dominant philosophical system of his time, Hegelianism. Hegel had built a monumental philosophy in which history, reason, and reality formed a coherent system. To Hegel, everything could be integrated into a rational process. History had direction. The absolute spirit unfolded progressively. There was structure. Kierkegaard sensed something unsettling in that construction. In such an elegant system, the concrete individual disappears. Personal anxiety, intimate decisions, doubt, faith lived from within. All are absorbed into a universal discourse. And Kierkegaard rebelled. He wasn't interested in explaining the world as a totality. He cared about the individual who suffers, who doubts, who chooses. In 1843, he published Either/Or. In 1844, The Concept of Anxiety. In 1849, The Sickness unto Death. His works aren't traditional abstract treatises. They're psychological and spiritual analyses of human experience. In The Concept of Anxiety, he defines anxiety as the experience that arises in the face of possibility, not a concrete danger, but freedom itself. An animal doesn't feel existential anxiety. It reacts to danger. Humans, on the other hand, can imagine options. They can foresee consequences. They can choose between incompatible paths. And that's where vertigo comes in. When I stand at the edge of a cliff, I don't just fear falling. I experience something more unsettling. I know I could jump. That possibility belongs to me. That choice depends on me. That is, anxiety. And here the central problem begins to take shape. The problem that Nietzsche and Sartre would later pick up. Because while traditional faith provided a stable framework of meaning, modernity starts to weaken that framework. And the weaker it gets, the more room there is for individual freedom. But freedom isn't light. Kierkegaard introduces another key concept: despair. In The Sickness Unto Death, he argues that despair isn't simply sadness. It's a flawed relationship with oneself. It's refusing to be who you are or trying to be yourself without acknowledging dependence on God. For Kierkegaard, the human being is structured as a synthesis of finitude and infinitude, of necessity and possibility. If you try to assert yourself solely through infinite possibility, without limits, without a transcendent reference, you get lost. If you lock yourself entirely in necessity, without freedom, you also get lost. Despair arises when the synthesis breaks down. And here his position is clear. The solution isn't to eliminate God, but to enter into an authentic relationship with Him. Kierkegaard was sharply critical of the Lutheran Church of his time. He saw official Christianity as a comfortable, socially integrated institution that had forgotten the radical demands of the gospel message. For him, faith wasn't habit or tradition. It was an existential choice. In Fear and Trembling, he examines the biblical story of Abraham, willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. What matters to Kierkegaard isn't the general morality of the act, but the leap of faith. Abraham acts in a singular relationship with God that can't be rationally justified to the world. This leap isn't irrationality. It's the acknowledgement that faith carries risk, uncertainty, and personal responsibility. Kierkegaard didn't reject reason, but he insisted that there are decisive moments that cannot be resolved through universal arguments. The ultimate decision belongs to the individual, and here his thought takes on striking relevance today. In a society where traditional structures lose their strength and grand narratives weaken, the individual is more exposed than ever to freedom. Modern anxiety isn't an isolated clinical phenomenon. It's partly the result of living in a horizon where certainties are eroding. Kierkegaard didn't celebrate this anxiety. He recognized it as inevitable, and he offered a way forward: the leap of faith. Nietzsche would reject that path. Sartre would deny it outright. But all three agreed on one fundamental point: human beings cannot hide forever in the crowd. Kierkegaard drew a distinction between the individual and the crowd. The crowd dilutes responsibility. When everyone does something, no one seems accountable. When a norm is collective, the individual feels shielded by the social structure. For Kierkegaard, however, truth is always subjective in the existential sense. What matters isn't just whether a proposition is correct, but how the individual relates to it. It's not enough to affirm doctrines. They must be lived. And this brings us back to the central question. If God exists, the individual's responsibility is to answer to Him. But if God doesn't exist, to whom does one answer? This is where Nietzsche enters the scene with a radically different response. And the problem is no longer anxiety before God. It becomes the emptiness left in his absence. When Nietzsche declares that God is dead, he does so in a specific passage of the Gay Science. In the famous aphorism 125, known as the Madman, there he describes a man bursting into the marketplace, shouting that he is looking for God. The crowd, no longer believing, mocks him. Then the madman announces, "God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him." The scene isn't an attack on naive believers. It's an accusation aimed at European culture. Nietzsche argues that modernity has undermined the metaphysical and religious foundations that once supported its value system. But the consequences of that act are not yet fully grasped. The madman asks, "What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun?" The metaphor is precise. If the sun stops shining, it's not just the light that disappears. Orientation disappears as well. Nietzsche doesn't immediately celebrate this death. He diagnoses it, and he warns of the danger it entails. The danger has a name: nihilism. Nihilism isn't just the denial of God. It's the collapse of the value of supreme values. It's the experience that traditional categories, truth, goodness, purpose, meaning, no longer carry the weight they once did. Nietzsche analyzed this phenomenon with a clarity that would make him one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. He argued that Christianity had structured Western morality around an inversion of values. The weak, the humble, the suffering, the obedient are turned into virtues. The strong, the affirmative, the proud are treated as sinful. In On the Genealogy of Morality, published in 1887, he develops this thesis with historical and psychological detail. According to Nietzsche, Christian morality arises from what he calls resentment, a reaction of the weak against the strong. Unable to assert themselves physically, they transform their impotence into moral superiority. The problem isn't just historical, it's structural. If that morality loses its transcendent foundation, yet we continue to live within its categories, we fall into contradiction. We keep talking about absolute equality, universal compassion, unconditional rights, but we no longer share the metaphysical ground that justified them. This is where modern nihilism begins. Nietzsche distinguishes between passive nihilism and active nihilism. The first is resignation, loss of meaning, apathy. The second is the destructive phase that tears down outdated values to make room for new ones. And here comes the decisive question: who creates these new values? Nietzsche answers with a symbolic figure, the Übermensch, usually translated as overmen or superhuman. It appears most prominently in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The Übermensch isn't a biologically superior individual, nor a ruling race. It isn't a political project. It's a metaphor for the individual capable of creating their own values after the death of traditional ones. The superhuman is the one who affirms life without needing a transcendent world to justify it. Someone who accepts that no external foundation is guaranteed and still says yes to existence. And here another key concept enters: the will to power. The will to power isn't simply a desire for political domination. In its broadest sense, it's the fundamental drive of all living things to expand, assert themselves, and overcome resistance. In Nietzsche, it isn't a closed, systematic concept. It appears in multiple texts with different nuances. Taken together, it expresses the idea that life is not passive preservation, but a creative impulse. If God is dead and no values are given, the will to power becomes the force through which the individual creates. But that creation isn't easy. Nietzsche also introduces the idea of the eternal recurrence. He poses the hypothesis that everything that happens will repeat itself infinitely, in exactly the same way. Not as a proven cosmological doctrine, but as an existential experiment. The question is, if you had to live your life over and over again, eternally, without changing a thing, would you accept it? If the answer is yes, you have affirmed life in the most radical sense. If the answer is no, you remain dependent on some external hope to compensate for what you find lacking. The eternal recurrence is an ethical test, not a physical dogma. Nietzsche, however, offers no comfort. His proposal is demanding. It requires abandoning the security of a transcendent order and taking on the risk of creation. And here a tension arises that cannot be ignored. If every individual creates their own values, how do we avoid absolute conflict? If there's no higher standard, what prevents one person's will from violently overriding another's? Nietzsche didn't develop a complete political system to answer these questions. His thought is more provocative than prescriptive. This partly explains why his work was interpreted in very different ways throughout the 20th century. His sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, who held nationalist and anti-Semitic sympathies, manipulated certain posthumous texts to align with ideologies Nietzsche had never explicitly supported. Yet the ultimate responsibility for those appropriations is a complex issue, one that historical research has extensively examined. What is clear, however, is that Nietzsche was not a systematic ideologue of totalitarianism. He was a radical critic of Western culture, trying to carry the consequences of the loss of transcendent foundations to their limit. But here we return to the question that opened this journey. If God is dead, and human beings must create their own values, are they capable of shouldering that task? The scene in Turin, documented during his collapse, though not in every detail, takes on an unavoidable symbolic significance. Not because it proves any definitive psychological thesis, but because it reveals human fragility under extreme tension. Nietzsche sought to free humanity from transcendent tutelage. But absolute freedom is not comfortable. It is a burden. And that burden would be formulated even more directly by Jean-Paul Sartre in the 20th century. Because if, for Nietzsche, the death of God opens a space for creation, for Sartre, that death becomes a condemnation to freedom. When Jean-Paul Sartre asserts that existence precedes essence, he is not delivering a poetic phrase. He is making a precise ontological claim. It appears systematically in Being and Nothingness, published in 1943 and later presented in a more accessible form in his lecture Existentialism is a Humanism in 1946. The idea is straightforward. If God does not exist, there is no human nature predesigned in the divine mind. There is no plan inscribed before our birth. There is no prior essence that determines what we are meant to be. First, we exist. Then, through our choices, we build what we are. Sartre didn't arrive at this conclusion through theological speculation, but through a phenomenology of consciousness influenced by Husserl and also by Heidegger. In Being and Nothingness, he distinguishes between being in itself and being for itself. Being in itself is the mode of existence of things, full, compact, without gaps. Being for itself is human consciousness, openness, negation, possibility. Consciousness is not a thing. It is emptiness, a distance from itself. It can always question itself. It can always project toward what is not yet, and here freedom appears. For Sartre, human beings are not free at certain moments. They are freedom itself. Even when seemingly determined by social, economic, or psychological circumstances, we always retain a margin of choice in how we respond to those circumstances. We can resign ourselves, rebel, justify, or transform. This does not deny conditioning. Sartre doesn't claim that we all have the same material power. What he insists on is that, even within concrete limits, we remain responsible for our decisions. And here, the consequence is radical. If there is no God, no fixed human nature, no objective values given from the outside, then we are absolutely responsible. In existentialism is a humanism, Sartre puts it clearly. Man is condemned to be free, condemned because he did not create himself. But once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. And not just for what he does, also for what he chooses not to do. This point is crucial. We often imagine that responsibility is limited to explicit actions. But for Sartre, not intervening is also a form of choice. Not committing also defines a stance. Absolute neutrality is an illusion. To explain how human beings try to escape this burden, Sartre introduces the concept of bad faith. Bad faith is a form of self-deception. It's not just lying to others. It's lying to yourself to avoid facing your own freedom. The classic example he gives is the waiter who overacts as a waiter, reducing himself entirely to the role as if his identity were fully determined by that function. Or the individual who says, "I am like this," as if character were a fixed, unchangeable thing. In both cases, the person tries to turn themselves into an object, a determined thing, to escape the vertigo of freedom. Bad faith is comfortable. It allows you to say, "I have no choice. The circumstances force me. Society is like this. My character is like this." But for Sartre, even when real constraints exist, the attitude we adopt toward them is still our own, and this is where his thought becomes unsettling. If God does not exist, we cannot appeal to a divine will to justify our decisions. If there are no absolute values given, we cannot hide behind unquestionable transcendent norms. If there is no predetermined human nature, we cannot take refuge in the idea that this is just how we are. We are exposed, and this exposure is not only individual, it has a universal dimension. Sartre maintains that, in choosing, we don't only choose for ourselves. We project an image of humanity. When I act, I implicitly affirm that this action is valid for a human being in my situation. In a sense, every choice carries an exemplary weight. That's why responsibility is so heavy. We don't just decide who we are. We decide, in a way, what it means to be human. This thesis is not an invitation to narcissism. It's a call to commitment. Sartre lived consistently with this idea in many ways. He participated in the intellectual resistance against the Nazi occupation of France. He publicly opposed the Algerian War. He criticized both capitalism and certain aspects of Soviet communism. In 1964, he refused the Nobel Prize in Literature, arguing that a writer should not become an institution. Each of his political stances can be debated, but his commitment to the idea of personal responsibility is undeniable. Now, we must ask the question that runs through this entire journey. Kierkegaard proposes the leap of faith as a response to anxiety. Nietzsche proposes the creation of new values as a response to nihilism. Sartre asserts that there is no transcendent foundation and that freedom is unavoidable, but is simply assuming freedom enough to solve the problem of meaning? Sartre explicitly rejects the idea of a universal human nature guaranteed by God, yet he recognizes that freedom generates anxiety. Anxiety doesn't disappear when we abandon faith. It transforms. It is no longer anxiety before God. It is anxiety before one's own responsibility. And here, the problem becomes even more acute. Because if God doesn't exist, we're not just free. We're the only ones who can give life meaning. There's no higher court, no guaranteed redemption, no ultimate plan, just choices. And those choices shape who we are. At this point, existentialism hits its sharpest form. It's not just about debating God's existence as some abstract metaphysical idea. It's about grasping what happens when that idea is no longer the foundation of morality and meaning. If God exists, the burden of responsibility points upward. If God doesn't, the weight falls entirely on us. And that brings us back to the line that opened this journey. If God doesn't exist, you are the problem. But we still haven't tackled the hardest question. Can a human bear that weight without breaking? Can we create values without falling into chaos? Can we accept total responsibility without burning out? In the next section, we have to face that question head-on, because existentialism isn't just a diagnosis, it's a wager on human capacity. And that wager is still open. We've explored 3 different responses to the same historical rupture. Kierkegaard says the individual can't hold up alone. That anxiety exposes the need for an authentic relationship with God, not inherited cultural faith, but an existential decision that carries risk and personal responsibility toward the transcendent. Nietzsche argues that traditional values have lost their foundation, that the cultural death of God demands a radical reevaluation. He doesn't just call for destruction, he calls for creation. But creation requires strength, affirmation, the ability to face life without external guarantees. Sartre takes the logic to its extreme. No God means no pre-given essence. No essence means no fixed human nature. No fixed nature means every act defines who we are. No metaphysical excuses, only freedom and responsibility. 3 diagnoses, 3 wagers. But the problem remains. Because beyond the internal logic of each system, the question is practical. We live in a culture that, to a large extent, no longer organizes moral life around an unquestionable transcendent authority. Even believers live in a pluralistic environment where faith competes with multiple worldviews. We don't live in medieval Christendom, we live in late modernity, which means the existential question isn't abstract. It's every day. When you choose your career, when you decide whether to commit to a relationship, when you define your ethical boundaries. When you vote, when you stay silent in the face of injustice, or step in, you are exercising freedom. And that freedom has consequences. Existentialism isn't an invitation to constant drama. It's a call to awareness. It's not about living in perpetual anguish, but about recognizing that our choices aren't backed by any automatic mechanism of meaning. If God exists, your responsibility points to Him. If God doesn't exist, your responsibility doesn't disappear. It intensifies. This is where many try to find a middle ground, to hold on to strong values without accepting their transcendent foundation, to defend absolute principles without acknowledging the metaphysical structure that supported them, to preserve morality without the God who justified it. But Nietzsche had already pointed out this tension. Remove the foundations, and values start to float. And when they float, they can weaken or become tools of power. Sartre, on the other hand, embraces the void and insists that we must create without leaning on absolutes. But that creation demands coherence and commitment. It's not whimsy. It's not comfortable relativism. And Kierkegaard warns that without an authentic relationship with the transcendent, the individual can get lost in despair. We aren't obliged to accept any of these answers as final. But we can't ignore the question, what foundation do you build your life on? If you claim God doesn't exist, you have to explain how you uphold your values. If you claim God does exist, you have to ask yourself whether you live consistently with that claim. Existentialism doesn't solve the problem for us. It keeps us from avoiding it. Maybe that's why it still matters today, not because it offers comfortable answers, but because it forces us to take responsibility for choosing. Let's return to the Turin scene beyond the exact details. The undeniable fact is that Nietzsche devoted his life to thinking through the consequences of God's death. The undeniable fact is that Sartre publicly accepted that no pre-given essence excuses us. The undeniable fact is that Kierkegaard insisted that the ultimate decision belongs to the individual. 3 paths, but a single demand: don't hide, don't dissolve into the crowd, don't take refuge in social autopilot, don't completely hand over your responsibility. Freedom can be heavy, but denying freedom doesn't make it disappear. It only hides it. And here we reach the final point. If God doesn't exist, no one will come from the outside to set your course straight. If God doesn't exist, no one guarantees that your values have cosmic backing. If God doesn't exist, meaning isn't handed to you, that doesn't mean life has no value. It means that value depends on how you live it. The question isn't whether the universe has an inherent purpose. The question is whether you act as if your life has one. Because even those who claim that everything is absurd are still making a statement that shapes their actions. There is no absolute neutrality. So, beyond theological or metaphysical debates, one question remains unavoidable. If God doesn't exist, are you ready to fully take responsibility for being who you are? Not in theory, not in conversation, in your concrete decisions. Because maybe the real problem isn't whether God exists or not. Maybe the real problem is that, in any case, you can't stop choosing, and choosing always comes with a cost.